Hey everyone, welcome to the 6-Day Mobility Challenge. I am Laura Thomas. I am a fitness coach out of Cleveland, Ohio, and I work with mostly women, primarily women who have really full lives. A lot of my clients have full-time jobs. They are really usually close with their families and they're givers. They're usually givers to their community. And some of them have children, some of them don't. And a lot of times what we're trying to do is work in a fitness routine that works with their lifestyle, access to equipment, and time being the big thing, right? Time's always like of the essence. So my clients, especially the ones with families, time is very valuable. And also a lot of my clients, like I said, work full time. So that's another factor that kind of plays into how often they can work out and when. So I wanted to host this mobility training for a couple of reasons. Number one is that actually I have been taking Rustin's mobility training for the last, oh gosh, I don't know, a few months that I've been working through it. So it's actually a mobility recipe book that I've been working through the last few months. And it's a lot because every long video has several sequences of exercises. So it's a lot for me to process each time. So I've been going through it very, very slowly. And one of the things that we've come to realize as fitness practitioners is that a lot of our clients know how to work out, right? Meaning they know the basics, they know squats, they know lunges, pushes and presses, those types of things. But what a lot of times is not really established is the mobility part of it. So in order to execute a squat effectively and usually to the best range of motion, we want to make sure that, for example, ankle mobility is playing and hip mobility is playing into it. Same thing with the deadlift, right? When we think about a deadlift, we want to make sure that hip mobility again is coming into it, posterior chain and the hamstrings and things like that are coming into it. And if that's not happening, then what we're going to see is shortening of those movement patterns, and they're not going to really reach into the fullest extension. Now, not everyone has to squat 90 degrees and not everyone has to deadlift 150 pounds. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that we have to make sure that people are doing things, at least to the best of their personal body's ability, in a way that's not going to move them into movement patterns that are long-term going to affect them in a negative way. So let me know if that makes sense or not. You can always email me back and let me know. So I also wanted to record this video because the intro part of this guide is a little bit long. So I'm going to actually kind of talk you through it. So if you don't want to read it, you can read it. But if you don't feel like reading it and you're like, okay, I just want to cut to the chase here, then watch this video because it's going to kind of just give you a little bit of an overview and things like that. So I am going to be looking down at the guide while I'm talking a little bit. So don't think that I'm not paying attention or anything. So mobility affects a lot of things, right? It affects how we feel when we get up in the morning. It affects the ease of our daily activities, how limber we stay as we get older, and then overall fitness, strength, and performance. So again, this is a really great exercise regimen to incorporate as a warm-up, I would say more of a warm up versus a cool down. This is going to also be something that you incorporate into an active recovery day. It can be on a day where you're going to take a walk, maybe do something maybe low impact, but you want to do a little bit of mobility work before you take that walk or hike. These are great exercises to incorporate into those activities. So mobility has a tremendous impact on your quality of life because when you move better, you feel better. So the mobility challenge is going to follow as in we're going to work on a different joint every day. And then at the end, we're going to bring everything together and make it one full training. So the videos are going to be of Rustin. I may jump in and do a couple little things here and there. Mostly they'll be Rustin's videos because he's so great at explaining things and I learned really well from him. So I'm going to let you do that part of it, but I will maybe jump in and give a little bit more elaboration on a few of the different exercises that he presents. So mobility is the ability to move freely and easily, and it's the active range of motion through your joints and muscles. So we're going to talk about, mobility is vital. It's super vital when it comes to having a body that performs for you in everyday life. And by the way, this is not about bodies that are, smaller or larger or anything like that. You can have mobility no matter what body size you have. So it's the simple things, right? It's being able to reach overhead to get something off the top shelf in your kitchen, bending down to pick something up off the floor, being able to turn your head, look over your shoulder when you're driving, right? And you're not pulling your neck when you do that. And again, like I mentioned earlier about getting into a deep squat and not feeling pain in your knees or having shortened range of motion because of your ankle mobility. So mobility can kind of be looked at as like applied flexibility. Now, flexibility, on the other hand, is the ability of a muscle or muscle groups to lengthen passively through a range of motion. So I think a lot of times when we think about flexibility, sometimes we think about like the people in yoga that can do like crazy back bends and things like that. Kind of, that it definitely is some flexibility, but a lot of times those people are what are called hypermobile. And so we don't want to confuse flexibility with hypermobility either. So an example of flexibility would be like lying on the floor on your back, your knees bent, feet flat on the floor, and raising one knee towards your chest. So I'm going to do it kind of seated, but kind of like doing this on the floor, grabbing your knee, pulling it closer to your chest, but keeping your back on the floor, and seeing how your hip feels when you do that, right? That kind of gives you a indication of where your hip range of motion is. Now, stability, which is also really important, and we're going to talk about this, is the strength to stand or endure, the property that restores a body when disturbed to its original condition. So I was actually just on a webinar, like literally right before I decided to record this, with one of my favorite people in the industry. His name is Gray Cook. I actually have one of his things coming up next on the guide. And one of the things that he said is stabilization precedes movement, meaning if our stabilized joints aren't where they quote unquote should be, so they're not stabilizing in the way that they should be supporting our body, then that will actually kind of, I don't want to say the word mess up, but it's not going to put your mobilizers in the correct spots. Now your stabilizers are your knee, your lumbar spine. So your knee, your lumbar spine, so your low back, and then your cervical spine, which is your neck. Those are your stabilizers. And then your mobilizers are your ankle, your hips, and your thoracic spine, so your mid back. And this all together is called the kinetic chain. I know this. And your body, it's basically connected joints that allow you to move while also keeping you safe and stable. So we're in football season, right? So for example, when a football player tears their ACL, what's happening is they're taking the knee, which is a stabilizer, and they mobilized it. And it went out of turn and it did something it wasn't supposed to do. And hence that ACL tear happens, right? Just a way to like think about it. So mobility is designed to keep your body safe and strong. Your joints also need an anchor point, a start and stop position, so that they can move through their normal ranges of motion at an appropriate speed. So without that anchor, they can kind of become unstable and set you up for all sorts of problems, like I mentioned earlier. Another way to think about this, and what I also like to mention to people is, let's say I have low back pain, and I'm not negating a lot of people have low back pain. What we also need to think about when we say we have low back pain is where is the origin and the insertion of the muscles of the low back. And is the back pain, yes, the back pain is in your low back, but is it coming from one of the insertions or origins that may or may not be as strong as it could be, right? A lot of times that's what's happening. If you've watched many of my videos before, I talk about if you have low back pain on one side, sometimes it's your upper back that's not strong enough, and therefore your lower back is taking the brunt of the pain or the movement when your upper back is just not turned on and needs to be engaged in the movement pattern as well. So when you scroll to page 10, you'll see what I literally just talked about is the joint by joint approach, which is Gray Cook, who's a renowned physical therapist that I actually had the privilege of working with a few years ago in Baltimore, which was amazing. And basically this is his model, and I love it because it's super simple, it's color coded, and it's a way that all of us, even if we're not fitness professionals, can really look at this and go, oh, okay, that totally makes sense. I get how my body works together in a kinetic chain. So some examples, you have a lengthened muscle in your ankle because you had a sprain. So that forces your knee or hip to help with stabilization, right? So the ankle being a mobilizer, and then your knee is a stabilizer and your hip is a mobilizer. You have a torn knee ligament, like I just talked about, affects your ankle, hips, and spine. Your shoulder and chest muscles are tight. So we get that a lot nowadays, right? Because we sit and we do this, right? Which limits the mobility of our neck a lot, high-tech neck, our back, sometimes our elbows, and other joints that are associated with our upper body. Now let's talk a little bit about fascia. So fascia is a thin casing of connective tissue that surrounds and holds every organ, blood vessel, bone, nerve fiber and muscle in its place. So fascia contains a rich network of nerves that make it almost as sensitive as skin. When it is stressed, it tightens up. So one way to think about fascia is your IT band. A lot of people have really tight IT bands. It's not uncommon, and your IT band runs down the side of your leg. Now, one thing that we sometimes do for our IT band, it's good to get our IT band to move, but our IT band is also kind of like duct tape in the way that it's always going to have some kind of tautness and tightness to it. So when we actually try to myofascial release it and like foam roll right on the tendon, it's actually not very helpful because it's never going to really get more like lubricated and limber in that way. So what I tell people, for example, with the IT band is if you're going to roll it, you want to roll kind of in front of the IT band, so closer to your quad, and then towards the back and towards like your posterior chain and your hamstring, right? You don't want to roll it right on the tendon there. So fascia does not discriminate. It simply keeps growing and eventually hardening into whatever shapes you make most often with your body. So scientists are continually learning more about fascia, the role it plays in our movement and our health. So that's the tissue that kind of ties it all together, right? Healthy fascia stretches and glides and moves because it's flexible and supple. But if it becomes damaged or unhealthy, it gets thick and sticky and it can dry up and tighten around your muscles. So if you ever try to roll a knot out using a foam roller, you know kind of firsthand how this can be. I also really love using massage balls as opposed to a foam roller. I do like foam rollers, but we also sometimes can't get into certain muscle groups with a foam roller. It's too big. So having a great set of massage balls, I personally love Yoga Tune-Up because they come in 3 different sizes and you can really get into the nooks and crannies of your back, your neck, and all those places. So real quick, let's talk about things that can affect your mobility. So age, right? Obviously, as you get older, unfortunately, your mobility tends to go down. So things that are playing a role is less lubricating fluid in your joints, thinner cartilage around your joints, and then shorter ligaments. So a lot of times this is caused by one thing, which is lack of activity. So if you weren't very active in your younger years and now you're 60, 70, 80 years old, it can be really hard to kind of get you mobile at that age. So lack of activity, moving your joints regularly helps keep the fluid moving around them, while inactivity can cause cartilage to shrink and stiffen, reducing your joint mobility. So no matter your age, being more active can help improve mobility. I don't know if you've seen it before, but my dad can do a half pigeon at 71, like no problem, but he's been doing yoga now for a solid 15, almost 20 years probably. So I'm so happy about that because he's continuing to move his body in a way that feels good for him. How you're built, we're all built differently. And some of us have more joints that allow more movement than others. So again, going back to the example of yoga, I am not a very hypermobile person. I can't flop into a back bend like that. But if you look at my parents, they're not super hypermobile either. So I just, it's something I have to work at, but I'm never gonna be able to be that person who can just drop into wheel and be completely cool with it, like a back bend. And we all have different individual differences in our fascia and our connective tissue. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So tissue surrounding your joints. If there's a lot of muscle or what's called adipose, which is fat tissue surrounding a joint, it can physically prevent your joints from moving through their full range of motion. So an example here would be like a bodybuilder with large biceps and tricep muscles that get in the way of fully extending or contracting their elbows. So they're they're always in concentric or a really strong pose all the time, and they have a hard time with elbow mobility and joint mobility. Lastly, injuries. Injuries absolutely play a role in mobility. Tissue damage from repetitive use can play a role in joint mobility. So this could be from an injury in sports to, a car accident or any other type of trauma to the body that also plays a role in mobility as well. So what are benefits of mobility? So a lot of times when we're working through mobility, we have a lower risk of injury. So studies show that having a smaller range of motion through a joint raises your risk of getting injured. Another benefit of mobility is improved posture. So tight joints can throw your body out of whack completely. So for example, if your hips lack mobility, it can affect your spine, can cause shoulder stiffness, and even affect your neck. I'm going to talk about this in a second. Let me give you an example. Ease of movement. So have you ever tried to reach your arms overhead and found that they wouldn't straighten or that they wouldn't extend without shrugging your shoulders? I see this a lot. In fact, this is probably one of the number one mobility restrictions that I do see, because again, we're living in a society where we're doing this all day. So we're shortening our pectoral muscles, and then when we go overhead, we're compensating by ribbing and pushing out our rib cage and shrugging the shoulder up. So a lot of times I'm working with clients and giving them mobility exercises to ensure that their shoulder can continue to go through a range of motion that is appropriate. Active aging is another thing that benefits mobility. So if you think this doesn't apply to you, it definitely does. Your mobility kind of starts to go downhill a little bit right around the age of 30. And now we can kind of like step into it. So for me personally, I'm just going to share a quick story, because I think that it's important that you understand that I don't just like preach this and I'm like, yeah, here you go. I actually do this work myself. I have been seeing a manual therapist for about the last year-ish. And it's a little bit different than what I'm going to be teaching you. It's called functional release conditioning, but kind of similar. And what I've been working on is my neck mobility, because I hold all of my tension in my neck, like right here, and my levator, and then in my traps, and then in my upper body, and a lot of times in my scapular area, which is back here. So what happens for me is that I start getting like super, like when I have stress, when I haven't moved in a while, like I was in the car last weekend for way too long, I start to get like lock up through this whole area. So for me, I have to do some neck mobility exercises to really help myself get into that position and get more range of motion in my neck. If I don't do those, then I am, like in a lot of pain, and I can barely like move my neck around. So I have been going to somebody who's been describing me exercises that help my neck. So I'm actually going to probably include a video so you can kind of see a before and after of when I have just done one session of neck mobility with my practitioner. So again, we're going to go into some exercises this week. Super excited. We're going to work on improving range of motion. We're going to start with the ankle. Why? So your body, and literally actually just heard this in this session before this as well, we're going to start from the ground up, because that's how we're built, and that's what our bodies move. So a lot of times what we don't focus on is feet strength. And it become very, very apparent to me the last couple of years that feet strength is just so vitally important. It's a great reason why yoga is such an awesome addition to anyone's strength training or conditioning work, because it forces you to A, work out barefoot, and B, grip the ground with your feet to stabilize yourself. So a lot of times what happens is we don't have the feet strength, and therefore our ankles aren't very mobile. So that can be a little detrimental. So we're going to start with the ankle feet area, and then we're going to work our way up to our hips and pelvis area, because again, this is an area where a lot of us have shortened hip flexors from doing just this, sitting all day. So we're going to work on the hip. Then we're going to move up the spine to the upper and middle back, which again, usually people are pretty strong there, but you just don't know. So it's a great area to continue to strengthen and improve and get some mobility in. Shoulders, like I mentioned before, is an area where I see a lot of lack of range of motion. And then our wrists and our necks, these smaller areas, but that are very, very vital. And if there's pain or discomfort there, it can be really detrimental to our bodies. So you'll notice some of these moves are going to be a little bit more, they're going to kind of look a little yoga-esque. They're not yoga though, because they're going to be performed more of a dynamic motion. So you're going to see like thread the needle, but we're not going to thread the needle and hold it. We're going to thread the needle and then bring it up again, and then thread the needle and bring it up again. So it's going to be more of a dynamic movement versus a like flexibility passive movement. So one of the questions we get asked, or I get asked, is how often should you do mobility training? And again, at least 2 to 3 times a week. I usually program this in for my clients into their warm up. And then if they want an extra day of something to do, sometimes I'll say, do your warm up, or, do this before a hike or a walk or something that you're going to do that's not super strenuous, just to get that extra mobility in. The best time of day to do mobility exercises is basically whenever you have the time. Again, they make a great warm up. You can do them on your own whenever. It can be something you do in the evening while you're watching your favorite show or whatever the case may be. And how long should it take? Again, a routine that works for you, we try to keep it to like 10 to 15 minutes so that you can go into your workout or work on other things. I always say that the warm up should be around 20% of your workout time. So if you're doing a 30-minute workout, a 6-minute warm up is probably right where you need to be. But I'm also a fan of a long warm up because I'd rather have the nervous system and the body really primed. Another thing to think about too is, all movement is generated in the body, but laid down in the brain. And that was a quote from Gina Schatz. I went to one of her workshops yesterday. I've just been doing all kinds of things. And it's just, it is like the movement pattern is in your body, but your brain, your nervous system is telling your body what to do. So getting your brain really engaged in the movement pattern is super, super key in all of this. So that's all I have for our introduction video. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reply back to this email and let me know. And then if you want to forward the challenge onto a friend, please feel free to do so. And they can always happen whenever they sign up. So thanks so much, and I'll see you soon.